So welcome to the session on educational rights and group vitality. We have 3 presentations this afternoon. I'm just going to read the biographies, and then we'll go through all the presentations, and we'll have a Q&A session after all 3 presentations. So our first speaker, Stephen Thompson. Stephen Thompson is the Director of Policy and Research at the Quebec Community Groups Network, a position he has held since 2009. He holds a master's in constitutional law from the Osgoode Law School in Toronto. Thérèse and Nguyen works with a team of data ambassadors across Canada to promote data literacy. She's been an analyst and advisor within the Eastern Region Office for the last 18 years of Statistics Canada. During this time, she's had the opportunity to work on various analytical projects involving diverse sources of data and to advise clients on how to conduct their own projects effectively. Our third speaker, Bourhis, has a BSc in psychology from McGill University and a PhD in social psychology at the University of Bristol, England. He taught psychology at McMaster University in Ontario and at Université de Québec at Montreal, where he is emeritus professor. He published extensively in English and French on discrimination and intergroup relations, language policies, cross-cultural communication, immigration, and acculturation. He received a doctorate honoris causa at Université de Lorraine, France, and was elected Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and was awarded the Gold Medal Award of the Canadian Psychological Society. So we will start with Stephen Thompson. 20 minutes each.
Hi, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here and for you this afternoon and to share the panel both with Thérèse and with Richard. Richard was on the committee that hired me at QCGN, and just about everything I know about the underlying sociology of linguistic minorities, I learned from Richard and from reading his work. He's truly a legend, and it's been a great pleasure, sir, to know you over the years. I'm going to start at the end. And before I start, I'm going to say that I wrote this paper because I wanted to help English-speaking Quebec know what Section 23 rights were. And when I started to write that paper, I thought, what a ridiculous thing. Why, after 15 years, am I still trying to communicate to a community of 1.2 million people that's been here for a few centuries what their friggin' minority language rates are? Don't they know it by now? And they don't. Russ Copeman yesterday, the keynote speaker at the ILET conference, gave you a primer on what your Section 23 rights are. So I'm going to read you the conclusion to my working paper, which is going to be published somewhere with this PowerPoint, and then we'll get into the PowerPoint. It seems clear that English-speaking Quebec is not benefiting from the full potential of the Section 23 right. Yes, the actions of the provincial government factor into this conclusion, but do English-speaking Quebec and right-holding parents share responsibility? There is no tradition amongst right-holding parents in Quebec holding the government or their school boards to account in the courts. Think about the experience of the Francophone minority outside of Quebec and the landmark cases of Mai, Rose Desvins, Arsenault Cameron, to name a few. There is a long tradition of right holders and parent associations fighting to defend their rights in court. The defense of Section 23 rights in the courts of Quebec has been delegated to school boards, acting independently or collectively through the Quebec English School Boards Association with the support of strategic and advocacy organizations like the Quebec Community Groups Network. There is no record of a parents' organization bringing a legal challenge or intervening, even intervening, in defense of minority language educational rights in Quebec. Unsurprisingly, a great deal of attention and effort continues to be put into defending school boards and their management and control of the schools. But there is decidedly a lack of energy being put towards other aspects of the right, like program of instruction and access to substantively equal services. And I finished the essay with why. Okay. Are you interested? Should I go on? Got everybody's attention now? Okay, good. It's all your fault. Let me tell you why. This is what, this is the outline of the presentation. This slide is called the nature of language rights. Before we get to that, just think about the nature of rights themselves, rights and freedoms, positive rights, negative rights. This is really about you regulate your relationship with the state being regulated. What can the state do to you? What can the state not do to you? That's really what human rights are all about. We won't get into a long discussion here. Some people spend their whole careers talking about where rights come from, but there are sort of inherent rights, rights that you have because you're a human being. So, and in the charter, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, they're called fundamental freedoms. So, no rights, freedoms, we won't get into that, but it's made up in shows. So, because you're a human being, freedom of religion, thought, belief, opinion, and expression, those are your fundamental freedoms. And no matter where you go in the world, in theory, you take those rights with you, and those rights must be respected. Those rights are reflected in international human rights instruments as inherent rights. The other rights that are in the Constitution, you think about democratic rights, mobility rights. These are rights associated with how the country is structured. We vote, okay? And what's our relationship when the police pull us over, right? That executive authority of the state. What's our relationship with that? Equality rights. That's a relatively new idea, that rights should be available, or the law should be available on a substantively equal basis, no matter who you are as a person. So the things you can't change about yourself, right? Your gender, your color, your religion, all those sorts of things. And then we have language rights. Language rights are interesting in international law because language rights are always tied to culture. They're always tied to culture or minorities, right? It's about minority protection. That's what language rights are about in international law. Okay. The other thing I want to talk to you about, just before we get off this page, is think about who defends your rights, or who should defend your rights. Who do they belong to, and who should defend them? Something to think about. All right, language rights themselves in Canada, they have a structural purpose. They're born of political compromise that allowed for confederation, and they are present in the Constitution Act of 1867. So I think we all know the sort of origin story of the Canadian state. Provinces that get together, the different provinces, British provinces come together, 1867. There's concern at the time to bring Lower Canada in, and so there are language rights put in Section 133 of the Constitution Act 1867, protect the use of French in Parliament and the National Assembly of Quebec. Some people think that English and French are used in the National Assembly, that was a mechanism to protect English in the National Assembly. It actually wasn't. It was in there to protect the use of French in the National Assembly, because there were times in the mid-19th century where, this is incredible, but if you served in the National Assembly, you had to swear allegiance to the king in English. And English was the working language of the National Assembly. So the protections that were put in 1867 were actually to protect the use of French in the National Assembly. Kind of interesting. Courts, those sorts of things. Anyway, the point here is that language rights are inherent. They have a structural purpose to the country. And they're there from the beginning. All right. The other thing I'll just say while we're on this picture here is that as Quebecers, I think we'll very often hear political leadership in Quebec saying that they're speaking on behalf of Quebecers. We're in a federal state. We have two levels of government, right? So yesterday when Russ showed the flag with the school with the flag of Canada and the flag of Quebec, and asked the question, we're citizens of what? And the answer is we're citizens of both, right? In the constitutional system that we've established for ourselves, we're at once citizens of our province for the purposes of those things assigned to the province in the Constitution, and we're citizens of Canada for those things assigned to Parliament. So we're both at the same time. And think about this. If you're a minority, that's a good idea. Because if you're a minority and you're relying, and if you're a minority language group like us, and you're relying on the legislature of the province to protect your rights, you're relying on the majority to protect minority rights. That's not a good deal, as we've seen recently, right? You need the offset of the federal partner to protect the minorities. And that we're going to see in a minute, that's the purpose of Section 23. It's built into Section 23. So you want two levels of government, and you definitely want the federal partner, and you definitely want the federal partner standing up for minority rights. All right. Section 23, minority language rights. This is in the charter, right? When the Constitution was repatriated in 1982. They're remedial in nature. What the heck does remedial mean? Just what's a plain language meaning of the word remedial? What does that mean? Anybody? To make up for, to fix something that's broken. What's broken, or what's the concern in 1982? There's an idea, there's a history. I heard Mark Power say the other day that Section 23 and the remedial nature was put in for the Francophones because of Regulation 17 in Ontario in 1911. It's not true. There was also concern in that is true, but there's also concern in 1982 about what? What has just happened? What, within 10 years? Close? Bill 101. So it's remedial in nature for the English-speaking community as well, because there was concern that the government of Quebec had passed Bill 101 and that it would impact the educational rights of the English-speaking community. All right. Don't worry about Section 93. This is just to demonstrate. Remember I said that they're sort of built in the beginning? And in the beginning, they're not called language rights, they're called denominational school rights. Because the Catholics were, and the Protestants were, and so now the language changed in the secularization of states in the 60s and 70s, and when Quebec dropped the denominational school system. So the language changed, but the idea is there. The population remains sort of the same, and remember that point. Okay. Now, what's the purpose of the right? This is right out of mine without the parentheses. I'm very sorry. To preserve and promote the two official languages in Canada and their respective cultures. We'll get back to that in a minute. This is Section 23. Now, this is something people don't always recognize or realize. This is A, this is B. Quebec is not acceded to A, so Quebec hadn't acceded as this is what is in effect in Quebec. That means that unlike the other minority school systems in Canada, attendance at our minority schools has nothing to do with the language you speak. Absolutely nothing to do with it. It's about where your parents went to school. Not about what language you speak. All right. The school system off of the island of Montreal is nearly in 2012, my age there, 2012, is nearly 40% Francophone. We're Lorraine, I don't know if she's here. We went to Arvida a few years ago. Helen was there with us. Went to Arvida a few years ago and went to the Arvida High School. 138 students, 8 Anglophones. This is normal in Quebec outside of Montreal. Remember back to the purpose. What was the purpose of section 23? Protects language and, thank you. What interest do the Francophone parents have in the school? In the English school? What's their core interest? Thank you. Say it again, louder.
Having bilingual children,
Thank you.
having a choice.
Is it to preserve and promote and protect the culture of English speaking Quebecers?
Yeah. Did you plan, Helen?
Helen is not a plant. Helen is not a plant. All right, so one of the rights, before I go into these questions, one of the rights Russ did not talk about yesterday, and I wanted to talk to you about real quick, is substantive equality. I'm not going to go over the bullet points again. You also have a right to substantively equal service, quality service. So I'm going to read you the quote. And if any of you have children with special needs, or I'm going to tell you a story after this too. The quality of services must be substantively equivalent to that offered to the majority language students. The purpose is to ensure that right holders are not discouraged from sending their children to a minority school. Factors considered when determining substantive equivalency include not only physical facilities, but also quality of instruction, educational outcomes, extracurricular activities, travel times, to name a few factors. So yesterday I heard a story about the ministry is being late on eligibility certificates.
Yeah.
And some parents are deciding to send their kids to French school because of that. I heard that is a section 23 violation. What I heard from the stage was I can send people to the ministry to help them process the claims. Let me tell you what would not happen in a Francophone minority school system outside of Quebec. So think about that idea of substantive equality. In 2004, my son was in Sec 4. He was at Richelieu Valley Regional High School, Riverside School Board. The high school been open since 1969, and they shut it down. And they shut it down in November. And the reason they shut it down in November is because they're handing it back over to the Commission Scolaire Patriote. And before the French kids could go into that school in September of the next year, the school needed $15 million worth of renovation. So my son was moved to an abandoned school in St. Lambert for the rest of the school year. And then the following years went from a school of 800 kids to a school of 3,000 kids at Heritage, where I was promised that he would receive more services. As a result, Ryan spent 2.5 days on the bus, or 2.5 hours on the bus every day. Ask me how I feel over Riverside School Board. Is that the government's fault? The point to this story is I think there's an instinct that I've seen to point to the government and say it's the government's fault. It's the right of the parents and the right holders. And they're not standing up for their rights. They're accepting, a few years ago, the history curriculum controversy. The minister went on TV and said, it's not going to be ready in time, develop your own. We didn't. We waited. And my son put up with a year of school, I remember Sec 3, I think, with his teacher handing out, well, teachers know this, handing out photocopies because the textbooks weren't ready yet. Why? Why exactly? Anyway, so I have some questions. And there's a couple, I'm just gonna leave these questions, there's no answer to these, it's just. A lot of this word community gets thrown around a lot. No, what does it mean? What does it mean to you? English community, what does it mean to you? I'm putting you on the spot. What does the word community mean to you?
Gathering of people.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Andrew. Who is the community? And this is an important question because you heard about the Superior Court decision yesterday where the justice is expanding the idea of who the right holder is. Right? It takes a village to raise a child. Who? How far does that go? What does that mean? What does that mean where I live? What does that mean at Vassarville? I don't know. And these are important questions. Who gets to vote? I think the answer to that second question, my experience, is obvious. I don't understand, and I'm not throwing sticks at anybody. I don't understand why there's about 3 or 4 people that I've met, there might be more in this community, that understand Section 23. I don't know why there aren't policy people working in the school boards or a QESBA. I don't know, or the Parents Association. I have no idea. People say it's about money. Prince Edward Island has a Francophone population of 4,000 people. That's where Arsenal Cameron came from. When a community of 1.25 million people have a problem with a this is a question that I think that's why it's a working paper. I'm going to look at this more. I'm not sure Section 20. I'm going to leave it on this because I only have a minute left. As you can tell, I've already talked about this all afternoon. When Section 23 is conceived in 1982, I want you to think about what the country looked like, not really, but in people's minds. The Francophone minority outside of Canada looked like what? The Acadians, the Franco-Ontarians, Manitoba, they were Alberta, but there was sort of the classic settler white, white folks who paddle a canoe and set down a tent and there you go, right? And think about what did English speaking Quebec mean in the early 80s? Anglo-Quebecers. Remember that horrible term now, where the Jews, the Greeks, the Italians, all those other folks are now called allophones for some reason? But now they're part of English-speaking Quebec because they speak English at home or they watch Simpsons or something, I don't know. But the point is that the communities in 1982, and as this jurisprudence is being sorted out in the 1990s, and the idea of the protection of culture is being put forward as the reason for these rights, the cultures were largely homogeneous. They're not anymore. Think about the Francophone community in Ontario now, in Toronto, in Manitoba. These are very diverse, multicultural communities that speak French. Do they have a common culture? So I think that we're sort of the canary in the coal mine here. Because we're so diverse, I think that the right is evolving here. And I don't know what that might look like. I just want to go to the last slide here and point out this, that Section 23 was born of political compromise. That means when the next round of constitutional talks come, and I think, I'm not alone here, I think they're coming sooner rather than later. I think that there will be big constitutional talks within the next decade. That's back on the table. And if English-speaking Quebec doesn't know what its rights are now, how is it going to sit at the table and protect itself when the adults sit down? When Canada and Quebec sit down? That's it.
So it's a good thing. I think that Stephen came right in before me, because talking about all these articles and the laws, etc. And I like the way that you mentioned the Section 23 was introduced in 82, so almost more than 40 years ago. And what I'm going to talk to you about now, it's about those children that are eligible to the instruction in minority language. But this, from the census, coming from SACAN, it's only new in 2021. So what happened between those 40 years that the section was introduced, and what took so long for StatCan? I mean, not that we decide, but for all the different governments to sit together and then decide that we're going to put these questions in and ask these to monitor to see a good portrait of these children, if they're entitled or not. Like, what it took 40 years to get there, and the issue even before 82 was already known. So with the census 2021 that I hope you guys all filled out, I'll just like to talk to you about the new questions that we added regarding the eligibility for the minority official language. Describe some of the concept and the variable that was derived from these questions, and then some portraits that we published last year, and then from now on, like, what should we be doing? What StatCan is doing to improve this sets of data. So I will skip this because I think Stephen had mentioned this already. And also I would like to draw your attention when going to look at the criteria here to describe or to identify which children are eligible or not eligible. So we separate this, for Canada, we separate in two parts. So the kids that are living outside of Quebec, so the minority language would be French. And as you can see here, there's 4 criteria, okay? And when we get to the next step, you'll see that it's a shocker for me. So for kids outside of Quebec, to be able to qualify as eligible to learn, to have the instruction in the minority language, it's either one of these 4. If they have one of these 4 criteria, they're allowed to have the instruction in French. So at least one parent of the child has French as a mother tongue, and then the rest is part of the schooling. So if at least one parent of the child attended or is attending now a regular French program or French language school in Canada during the primary education, if the child itself did attend or is attending, and if the brother or sister of that kid did attend or is attending. So keep note here, 4 criteria, and the difference now for kids in Quebec. So there's only 3 criteria, okay? Have you noticed which one is no longer there? The mother tongue, okay? And that's because of the, I don't want to get into detail because I don't even know it like by heart or in detail. It's simply because as Section 73 in Quebec has not, they've decided that we were not going to put emphasis on that part. So that's why for the eligibility criteria for the kids in Quebec, they're not taking into account the mother tongue. And you will see in the result eventually the different things will come out as because of that. And again, it's at least one of the following criteria needs to be there. So the different questionnaires that the questions that we add into the questionnaire to have this mapped out. So 13, 14, and 15 for people living outside of Quebec. So we want to ask them if they went to primary or secondary schooling in French. And then we ask them which type of program if they did, and the number of year in schooling in these programs. And the same thing for the kids living in Quebec. So we asked them primary, secondary schooling in English school, and how many years they did in primary or in secondary. These questions were asked in the short form and in the long form. So 100% sample. The only problem is that when we start cross-reference this data with the 25% samples with the other questions, the other data from the long form, the number will be a bit different. And you also notice at the end when we try to put these information with other source of data, we might encounter some other problems. So having introduced these questions, these 5 questions into the questionnaire, we were able to derive these variables. So we can now tell the eligibility of the instruction in minority language by the detailed type of criteria. So we can know for each kid which criteria they were selected, or was it just a single one, or multiple criteria that they tick. We can also see in terms of the schooling, so the primary and secondary schooling, the level and the type of program as well. And the last one here is the number of years that they did the schooling in those schools. So getting to some of the data that came out, close to 900,000 kids 0 to 18, under 18, were accounted for in Canada, and 1/3 of them was in Quebec. And you also have the age bracket here to see, like under 5 to 11, and 12 to 7. This age group was targeted for primary, secondary, and those are preschool. What's interesting here is following the census, what we see is that Ontario and Quebec has the highest number of children eligible. And it's in New Brunswick that the percentage of the children that were eligible, that actually there's more children in terms of percentage. So if I look in Quebec data, a little bit more than 300,000 kids were eligible. Among the total number of children under 18, they represent 18% of that subcategory, as opposed to in New Brunswick, the children that are eligible, they are not, almost 50,000, but they're representing 36% of that age group. We're pretty close to the next one that's closest to Quebec is Ontario. There are a bit more children there, but the percentage and representation is a bit less than us, with close to 13%. Now, this is what I find more interesting in terms of, so these diagrams represent the different criteria. So the one on the left side is for Quebec. So you only have the parent's education. So if the parent went to an English school or not, and the children's education. So those were the two types of criteria, as opposed to for outside of Quebec. So we have the third one, which is the mother tongue. And we can see here, so for Quebec, most of them is based on the education of the children, as opposed, and the one of the section here is the kids that have both criteria combined. I would be interested to know, I mean, I didn't do the exercise, but if you were to add in the mother tongue for Quebec, how would that data pop out, you know? And for outside of Quebec, we can see here the 9.2%. That's only for the sole criteria, but if you add them all together, it's a bit more than it's a bit more than 40% based on that criteria. So it's interesting, and I'm pretty sure that if we do that for Quebec as well, we'll get a fair good number in there too. Some other interesting information here. So if we look at the children now, but only the ones that are in school, in primary and secondary, out of this kids, 76% in Quebec are actually enrolled in the minority language instruction. So it's very good, but it's still below New Brunswick, where the children are enrolled to up to 80% of those who are entitled to. Stephen talked about his kid having to drive 2 hours, two and a half hours to go to school. And this is an interesting analysis that we did, combining the census information with the official language minority school database. So if you look at in Quebec, the more the distance is, it's larger, the larger the distance is between your home and the school, obviously less percentage of kids are going, right? So you see that for Quebec and for outside Quebec here, outside Quebec, so this one here is 20 kilometers and more, and I'm pretty sure, is it more than 20? Yeah. So you see here in Quebec, even though the distance are further, we still emphasis on, we do as much as we can to provide our kids the means to go to access those schools. It's something that you see less outside of Quebec, because we can see the percentage of kids that are enrolled into the minority language schools. So moving forward, we have the census data. We have some administrative school data, so we know actually where those schools are. But there's also the survey of official language minority population that we did last year. And these data will come out in, early next year. So in a couple of months. And what I find interesting here, so keep in mind at the beginning, I told you that there's certain variables that we can't, we don't have information, etc. For example, if you look at the language, and then you look at the knowledge of language, in the census questionnaire, we ask you, like, so what's your mother tongue? What is the language you speak at home most often, language at work, etc. But we don't ask the details of the language. So for example, like when you say you speak English, is in terms of the knowledge itself, is it, are you able to read, to write, to understand? So in this survey here, this is where we're going to go extract more information that's been missing in the census. For example, like your level of knowledge for each language that you're talking about, but also in terms of services. So we asked the people when accessing government services. So in terms of healthcare, were they able to receive the services in the choice of language? In what level, what type of service? Same thing for healthcare justice as well. We also ask questions on the intention. So for a parent that has children that are younger, or do they intend to enroll their kids into one of the schools that's available for minority language, etc. So I think this survey here really comes in to add more value to the census data, and I hope that budget cut or not, it will stay. So looking forward, this is where we are, what we are trying to do now at Statistics Canada. So yeah. And guide that we use and that you can check out to have more details. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to invite, we're going to save the questions for the end. I'd like to invite Richard, please come up.
The talk I will give today will be published in a new book coming out. Now, decades ago, I published a book called Decline and Prospects of the English-Speaking Communities of Quebec. Some of you remember that. This November 13, a colleague of mine, Jean-Pierre Corbeil, is publishing a book called Le français en déclin, repenser la francophonie québécoise. And it's so nice to see the two solitudes with similar titles, each of their languages in decline. Threat of decline. So my talk is about threat to linguistic minorities. The research was conducted with my graduate student Rana Sioufi at Université du Québec à Montréal, and with my friend and colleague Réal Allard at Université de Moncton. So there's quite a lot of research that has focused on international migrations to Canada. So we have a strong research tradition on that over the decades. In this study, we focus on perceptions of interprovincial migration in Canada's bilingual belt of Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick. In Canada, interprovincial migrants who have citizenship share the same, are free to migrate from any province of their liking. In this study, we surveyed the perceptions of interprovincial migrations by French Canadians and English Canadians as rated by Francophones. And the Francophones we had were minority Franco-Ontarian students at Université Laurentienne at Sudbury, Ontario, minority Acadians Francophone students at Université de Moncton, and majority Québécois Francophone students at Université du Québec à Montréal. So a classic study from a social psychological perspective. So what's the relative community vitality of these three language groups? Well, one little reminder for you that given the title of this conference, the vitality of a language community is defined as that which makes a group likely to behave as a distinctive and active collective entity in intergroup settings. And that's the definition that we had published in 1977 with Howard Giles, myself, and Don Taylor at McGill. Now, of course, the more vitality a language community enjoys, the more likely it is that it will survive and thrive as a collective entity in a given intergroup settings, and you all know about that. And we have three dimensions that contribute to the vitality of linguistic communities: demographic strength, institutional support, and social status. And this is represented in this slide where you have those three dimensions, and they can contribute to a strong group vitality for a particular group, or if they're weak on all of those factors, they'll contribute to a weaker vitality. We focus today on demographic vitality. And of course, the study was conducted in 2015 before the Francophone said that French was in decline in Quebec. It's kind of important to mention that. At that point, we were using mother tongue, and so the relevant census for the students in that study was simply the 2011 census, not that they were necessarily aware of it, but I'm just saying that's the context that we were dealing with. So we had about 79% of Québécois Francophones who had French as a mother tongue, about 6 million people, and we had 8.3% of the province that was Quebec English mother tongue speakers, around 647,000. And then for Acadians, we had 32% that were Francophones, representing about 240,000 people, vis-a-vis an English-Canadian majority of 65%, representing about 411,000 people. And then we had Franco-Ontarians representing 4.4% of the Ontario population, representing 561,000 citizens, and English Canadians in Ontario making up 70% of the population, about 8.9 million. So that's sort of the context, implicit context in which the study was conducted. The research questions were as follows. Do host community Francophone students prefer interprovincial migrants who are French Canadians or English Canadians for their province? Our one idea we had is that shared Canadian identity hypothesis that we had was that Acadians, Franco-Ontarians, and Québécois Francophone students prefer equally migrants that are English Canadians and French Canadians because we share the same Canadian citizenship and the same nationhood. So this is the ideal hypothesis for the study. We also have a two-solitude hypothesis that I kind of mentioned. Francophone students prefer French Canadian migrants more than English Canadian migrants to their province. And why? Well, we have about 3 types of responses to that, 3 options. We have what we call the in-group favoritism effect. People prefer members of their own linguistic group more than out-group members who are members of the other language group. And in a sense, we prefer us over them. And there's a lot of social psychology literature which shows that this is a fundamental trend amongst human beings on the planet. We prefer members of our own group over members of out groups, everything else being equal. There's also an historical threat hypothesis where French Canadians have felt discriminated and threatened linguistically by English Canadians from an historical perspective. And of course, minority groups have a longer memory for their disadvantages than dominant groups for well, the troubles that they made to their minorities. Now, there's also a vitality account, you could say, a vitality rivalry hypothesis, you could say, is that French Canadian migrants reinforce Francophone vitality and English Canadian migrants reinforce Anglophone vitality. It's a very simple hypothesis. We had 658 respondents. We had the Québécois francophones from l'Université du Québec à Montréal, as you can see, about 200. We had Acadians from l'Université de Moncton, and we had Franco-Ontarians from l'Université Laurentienne in Sudbury. They were all undergraduate respondents who share the same level of education and social class background. And in a way, they were future decision makers. And now these students are about 30 years of age. The respondents' age in the actual study were 22 years of age, more females than males in that study because we're in social science recruitment. The mother tongue was French. All were born in their respective province and all had parents who had the French mother tongue and were born in Canada. And of course, they did like we do in social psychology. They complete a questionnaire with a Likert scale, 7-point scale. I agree totally, moderately, or not at all to various items we have in the questionnaire. So now we're going to start with the preferences for immigrants, depending on their language and country of origin. And we're going to start with Franco-Ontarians. And by the way, we actually gave them 4 potential migrants that they could decide whether or not they'd like to welcome in their own province. Were French Canadian migrants from the rest of Canada, English Canadian migrants from the rest of Canada, and then we also have Francophone African immigrants as an option, and we also have the Anglophones from the United States. Just to mix it up a bit, and also get to feel how people feel towards these groups. So we start with our Franco-Ontarians. Well, who would they most like to have as migrants to their province? Well, French Canadian migrants from the rest of Canada and Francophone African immigrants. Those are the ones they really like. they're more ambivalent towards these other ones called English Canadian migrants from the rest of Canada, a strange place. And even less so Anglophones from the United States. Now we look at Acadian undergraduate students. Who do they prefer? Oh, they prefer French Canadian migrants from the rest of Canada and Francophone Africans immigrants. And who do they like less? Are Anglophones from the rest of Canada and Anglophones from the United States. Now, amongst Québécois Francophones, well, you would expect, Québécois Francophones are members of a majority as opposed to being a minority. So maybe they would like people equally, but no, sure enough. Québécois Francophones prefer Francophones from the rest of Canada, Francophones from Africa, and they less liked English Canadians from the rest of Canada and Anglophone immigrants from the US. So what's driving this so far is whether or not you're a Francophone or an Anglophone migrant to the respective province of these students. They're the future decision makers of these. Then we asked the students the contribution of these migrants to the vitality of Franco-Ontarians and the vitality of the Anglophone majority in Ontario. So these are the Franco-Ontarian respondents. And we asked them, how much of these migrants contribute to the vitality of Francophone people, Franco-Ontarians in Ontario? And what do we get? Well, they say that Franco-Ontarians contribute the most to the Franco-Ontarian community, of course. And then the Québécois Francophones also contribute quite a lot, and a bit less so Acadians. But the ones that contribute the least to their vitality are those English Canadians from the rest of Canada or from their province. Then we asked them about how much these four groups contribute to the vitality of the Anglophone majority in Ontario. So what they say is those who contribute the most to the vitality of Anglophones in Ontario are English Canadians from the rest of Canada, and less so Franco-Ontarians, Québécois Francophones, and Acadians. Well, you're going to say you're repeating yourself. Well, the data repeated itself. So now we ask Acadians. The contribution of migrants for minority Acadian vitality and Anglophone majority vitality. So for Acadians, those who contribute the most to their vitality are Acadians themselves, Québécois Francophones and Franco-Ontarians, and least English Canadians in their own province. And for vitality of the majority Anglophones in New Brunswick, it is Anglophone from the rest of Canada that contribute the most, and the least are, as you can see here, Acadians, Québécois Francophones, and Franco-Ontarians. Now we expected to get different results with Québécois Francophones because they are the majority of 80% in the province. So what we got with these Québécois Francophones was that those who contributed the most to Québécois Francophone vitality were Québécois Francophones themselves, Acadians, and least Anglophones from the rest of Canada. And those who contributed the most to the Anglophone minority in Quebec were seen to be Anglophones from the rest of Canada, and least were Québécois Francophones and Acadians. So here, as you can see, in the three cultural settings, there's a marked preference for Francophone groups as migrants for contribution to in-group vitality of Francophones. Then we also asked them, I'm almost finished, we also asked them how much their feeling of identity threat in the presence of the different groups that we've mentioned. So how much do the following groups threaten your identity? And as you can see with Franco-Ontarians, Acadians don't threaten their own identity. Acadians, Franco-Ontarians, and Quebecois don't threaten their identity. However, English Canadians do. Okay, much more so. We ask Acadians their feeling of identity threat in the presence of Acadians, Franco-Ontarians, and Quebecois Francophone, much less so than in the presence of English Canadians. But notice that Quebecois Francophones are a little bit threatening for the Acadians. What about Quebecois Francophone majority? They're the dominant group in the province. Well, they're not too worried about Quebecois Francophones that would be afraid of your own shadow. You have Acadians, not very much. However, both Quebecois Anglophones and English Canadians from the rest of Quebec are threatening. Much more so than Francophones. We did some mediation analysis, and it was the same results for the three settings. The more the respondents, the Francophones felt threatened by the presence of Anglophone, the less they wanted them as migrants to their own province. And that's the basic message of that particular study. And it's in line with a lot of research on the threat hypothesis. The more threatened you feel about an outgroup, the less likely you are to like them, you're more likely to have prejudice towards them, and you're more likely to not want them or to even be discriminatory towards them. So we have no support for the common Canadian identity hypothesis amongst Acadian, Franco-Ontarians, and Quebecois Francophone undergraduate. Sorry for federal civil servants here. We have much support for the two solitude hypothesis. Acadians, Quebecois Francophones, and Franco-Ontarians prefer French Canadian and African Francophones, migrants, rather than English Canadians and Anglo-Americans. And if they feel that their identity is threatened more by the presence of Anglophones from Canada and US, and Acadians, Franco-Ontarians, and Quebecois Francophones feel that their language and community vitality can be improved by the presence of French Canadian and French African immigrants. So I thank you very much. Bill Flock knows what that means. This is merci in Breton. We both have Breton ancestry. So of course I wanted to put that in my thank you range here of different languages.
So I'll invite all three speakers to please come and take a seat, and then we'll take some questions. We have
9 minutes.
10 minutes, yeah, 9 minutes. So I'm going to start with a quick question, and then Bill, I'm going to start with a quick question to Ishal. I'm wondering if any similar study has been done on English-speaking Canadians towards attitudes towards Francophone migrants to the rest of Canada, and what Acadian, if any study has been done looking at what Acadians and Franco-Ontarians have to say about English-speaking Quebecers, you know, whether we're placed in the same category as English Canadians. That's for you. That's my question here.
Well, unfortunately, I did not do the study with English Canadians about French Canadians as being migrants to their own province. What was the third?
English attitudes toward by Acadians and Franco-Ontarians towards Anglo-Quebecers.
So in the paper that was published, I published a paper in Journal of Multilingual and Multicultural Development, and I actually brought out some other parts of the results, which showed that Acadians and Franco-Ontarians were more ambivalent about Quebecois Francophones than we had expected. And we tried to understand why that was the case, you know, in the respective regions. But there are, of course, Quebecois Francophones that land up in Ontario and in New Brunswick. And having lived in Hamilton, Ontario for 10 years, I had noticed that some of the Quebecois Francophones that came to Ontario would kind of look at Franco-Ontarians and say, Well, first of all, you don't speak with a proper French accent, you know, because you speak with a Franco-Ontarian accent as opposed to a Québécois accent, which is terrible. No, you shouldn't do that. And also, they found them in that epoch too docile towards the Anglophone majority. So and that's something. So there was something going on between the three, between the Acadians, Franco-Ontarians, and Québécois Francophones that kind of shows that it's a more ambivalent relationship that one would have expected, perhaps just on the basis of language. That's my my point.
So we have a question from Mr. Flock. Could you please, when you're asking questions, please introduce yourself and tell us who you are.
William Flock, the Secretary for Relations and English-Speaking Factors. It's a small detailed question for Thérèse, but then a question for Stephen. In one of your slides, I think slide 12, you showed the overall school enrollment in English-speaking Quebec as being 175,000, which struck me as much higher than I'm used to thinking. So I just wondered if you could explain that. Is it because of public-private, or that was a question? I think that, you know, that would be good to have answer to. And then for Stephen, given what you presented, and you seem to be intimating that there's a lack of awareness about rights, and given, say, linking it to the presentation that Russell Copeman made yesterday, do you think, for example, that that will impact on voting patterns? Like, will people show up for elections if they're not aware, you know, that this constitutional issue at risk here? But also, I think you also underlined that many of the rights holders, especially in the regions, are French mother tongue, who send their kids to learn English, right? To be a bilingual education. So I guess one could question whether their commitment to that minority rights kind of, maybe they're just sort of free riders, beneficiaries of it, as opposed to invested in it. So I just wondered whether you had some thoughts about that. So maybe just on the detailed question to raise you.
Like, if it's much higher or not, I like, from the census questionnaire, what we ask, it's so whatever people filling out, it's self-declared, right? So there's no way for us to actually verify if they're actually in school or not, and following the regular program or the English minority program. So it's self-declared.
Yeah, that's the numerator part. The denominator, though, you were showing 175,000, which I think came from the schools database, if I understood.
I think that was maybe a typo on your slide. I have from your data, 175,000 children had attended school in English in Canada who reside in Quebec.
No, I think part of the problem is that 175 had gone through the system at one point. So maybe
Yeah.
parents
In Canada.
okay, not elementary school in English, and then go to
Yeah.
high school in French.
They hadn't gone, but they hadn't gone through English school. There weren't 175,000
At
kids.
that moment in time.
Correct. There were 80 in 2021, there were 83,000 students in the English system, with 14,000 in the private schools, for a total of 97,000.
Yeah. All right.
And
So, yeah.
but the numbers, we've talked about this, the numbers are very confusing. It took Andrew and I
But
a
I
while.
think what we need to understand, so we asked if the children did went to either primary or secondary. And so now, if on May 2021, if they reside in Quebec, but further before, when they were younger and they were schooling in Ontario, whichever part, that still counts, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think the data it's not easy to understand.
Yeah, so I think maybe just even a better explanation. The number is right then, what
Yeah.
you're saying, but it's, yeah.
And to answer your question, I'll answer your question with a story. So my wife's cousins, the Cloutiers from Thetford Mines, in the 70s, they had 8 kids. 4 of the kids went to English school, 4 of the kids went to French school. So there's the Cloutiers from Thetford Mines that all of their kids have gone through English school in Quebec City, and then Cégep, and then on to French University in a way. I think they're fiercely protective of their right to send their kids and their grandkids to school, but for different reasons. I think the perception in English-speaking Quebec is that the right is somehow tied to the government of Quebec. I don't think there's a perception that it's tied to the Constitution. And that they can, that right holders can individual right holders, like on their own, parents and parent associations can sort of fight for their rights. School voter turnout, I know there's a lot of systemic challenges there and voting lists, and like Russ went through the spiel yesterday. But for me, that's kind of like blaming, you know, you're not taking responsibility for your right to vote. If I'm in my neighborhood and I have a Facebook, in the neighborhood I live in, we have a Facebook page. And if a cat gets run over, 2 seconds later, we know there's a cat run over at the bottom of the hill. And I'm sure that there's parent Facebook pages out there for kids that go to specific schools, right? So why aren't the parents standing up and getting themselves mobilized to go and vote or to get better voting system? Why are they waiting for the school boards or the government to do it for them? Like these rights, my core message here in my presentation is these rights belong to the parents. They belong to the right holders, and the right holders don't seem to know what they are and don't seem to be standing up for themselves.
229. Quick questions. So we have one en français ou en anglais, ça va? Go ahead.
En français, pour que vous évitiez mon accent anglais et français des j'ai une question qui regroupe les trois thèmes. Pour la clause Canada, là, ce qu'on a appelé la clause Canada, c'est-à-dire le droit aux parents canadiens de mettre leur enfant dans l'école anglaise au Québec. J'aimerais savoir si vous aviez des données sur les migrations interprovinciales et l'évolution de l'utilisation de cette clause au Québec. Je sais que c'est le premier recensement, il y a ces données-là, mais est-ce que vous avez fait le recoupement avec, justement, avec les gens qui arrivent au Québec, de province du Canada, parce que l'immigration interprovinciale est en train de changer en profondeur en ce moment, notamment dans l'arrivée d'anglophones du reste du Canada au Québec, alors qu'avant c'était plutôt l'inverse.
De mon côté, on n'a pas fait cette étude nécessairement encore, mais c'est quelque chose qui peut être fait parce qu'on a cette information-là au niveau du mouvement migratoire à l'intérieur du pays. Donc, c'est quelque chose qui est effectivement très faisable et assez facilement là. Mais je ne l'ai pas fait malheureusement, je ne pourrais pas te dire.
En anglais, I don't have the data, but there are 175,000 kids who attended school in Canada, right? English school in Canada. There's 42% of eligible students who aren't attending English school in Quebec. I suspect that if we looked at this, it would be because people that move to Quebec from outside of Canada put their kids in French schools because they want them to learn how to speak French. And it's just not a question of learning how to speak French. They want them to have French friends. They want to be connected to Quebec society. There's a lot of things that you miss out on when you send your kids to English school. It's those connections, right? It's not playing with the kids, like the kids you're playing hockey with on the street aren't the kids you're going to school with. And you want that for your kids. So you send your kids to French school. There's a lot of other things, but I suspect, Celine's not here, but I suspect a lot of people that come from outside of Quebec to Quebec put their kids in.
Quick question from Deputy. Maria?
I'm Maria, teacher of the EMSB. I've read a lot of your research, Reverend Todd, and I feel you did like a 7-point Likert scale and you did a mediation analysis, very quantitative. Are you going to pursue any of these questions in a qualitative manner and kind of explore the beliefs that drive these feelings of threat, and in turn how these feelings of threat tie into identity with each linguistic minority?
Yeah, that's a very important point. Unfortunately, sometimes we're into quantitative framework, and for that thesis, it was all quantitative. We weren't into qualitative. So it takes a bigger research grant to be able to cover both grounds, the quantitative and the qualitative. But of course, they are complementary. So it's a very good point. I'd like to understand better this feeling of threat on the part of these francophones towards especially anglophone migrants. I was surprised with the results, of course. I was most surprised to find that the Québécois francophone majority felt as threatened by English Canadians as were Acadians and Franco-Ontarians. So I was asking myself, are Québécois francophones a dominant majority with the psychology of a threatened minority? Because in a way, they responded like Franco-Ontarians and Acadians.
Yes.
And if so, this could be precarious situation for the linguistic, ethnic, and religious minorities in Quebec. Because you can feel threatened, but when you have the power of the state working for you, it's different than if you're a minority.
Thank you.
All right. Past 3:30, so. One hand of applause for all our speakers and feel free to go get some coffee. Yay!